going to be talking about trust. And in this session, kindly sponsored by Intis Telecom, I'd like to welcome Louise Ford. It is the time now to come to the stage.
Thanks.
The Managing Director of Empello, and Luigi, Fidelio. Sorry, you're right there. Missed you.
Hello.
Right there. Please come along. Take your seats. Hello, and thank you both.
Thank you.
Excellent. So, first of all, some time to introduce yourselves. Luigi, if you'd like to introduce yourself and your company, because your company does something very different from any other MEF member that I'm aware of.
First of all, I want to thank you for putting me in this panel together with Louise, so that everyone can understand that my name, Luigi, is just the Italian version of Louise, not just a tribute from my parents to Nintendo, because I usually have to explain this. So I am Luigi Fidelio. I am co-founder and chief revenue officer of Messagenius. What we do in a nutshell is secure enterprise messaging. So basically, we offer enterprises a secure Slack alternative that is better than any other mainstream player in the market for security and data ownership, productivity, and integration.
So your focus is on internal messaging within organizations.
Exactly, internal comms.
And do you know what? I'm actually going to say I really like what Luigi has said, because personally, yes, folks, believe it or not, there was life before MEF for me. Shocking, I know, shocking to believe. But I had been talking for years and years and years to mobile operators, messaging companies, that why aren't you using your own solutions internally to communicate with your staff, rather than just simply sending an email? Why aren't you doing that? So fantastic having you here with us. And also we've got Louise Ford from Empello. Louise, can you tell us a bit about Empello and what you were doing before Empello?
Yeah, so Empello provides compliance monitoring and anti-fraud solutions in the mobile payment sector, specifically for carrier payments. Prior to that, I've worked for 20 years in the A2P and mobile payment space. So yeah, I've worked for a number of aggregators in the past, so A2P messaging and all that it can do is dear to my heart.
Fantastic. Excellent. Okay, so we're going to start off with, should be an easy question, but actually it's probably one of the hardest. Luigi, what does trust mean to consumers?
It means a lot, and when it comes to consumers and enterprises using instant messaging tools, it's really of paramount importance. Instant messaging in particular is very human-centric. So it is very much adopted both by consumers and by enterprises for internal comms, because it does the few things that people need to do. So it's very direct, very human, very warm. It's perceived as a very warm form of communication. And echoing what you were saying before, in terms of time, instant messaging has the advantage of being instantaneous. Instant messaging and asynchronous. So it's really, really useful for consumers and for enterprises. We can say it is basically the everyday habit of every mobile user worldwide. Actually, everyone owning a mobile will certainly access instant messaging applications. In terms of usage of instant messaging for internal comms in our experience, I would like to tell you about the case of a company that is the Italian owner of the national railway infrastructure. The CEO of the company and the production director of the company have considered our messaging so human and useful that they have used Messagenius to send a broadcast message, a text message, and a video message to the entire workforce, because it's a warmer way than just posting something on the internet to communicate with employees and as well with consumers. So I'd say of paramount importance, definitely.
Perfect. Same question to you, Louise.
So I went back to the Cambridge Dictionary for this one, and it said it's trust is the belief that something you use is safe and reliable. And reliability aside, consumers need to feel that they are safe when they transact on their mobile, and that's very complicated. I have one device, and I transact or communicate in a number of ways on that. I've got one device, I've got multiple carriers because I'm roaming, I've got multiple Wi-Fi, multiple apps, multiple channels, multiple payment methods that I use on that phone. And when you think about the myriad of combinations that gives you, to think of that as a consumer. Do I trust that every time I use a different one of these on my mobile, can I trust it? Is my data going to be safe? Kind of makes your head explode, really. And for the most part, I think consumers just trust that when they transact on their mobile, it's going to be absolutely fine. But when I sit here with my mobile ecosystem hat on, my professional hat, I know that's not necessarily the case. And I think Nick quoted some stats earlier this morning. Correct me if I'm wrong, Nick. Almost 40 billion fraud is worth in our ecosystem, and 2.2% of the market.
That was Igor from the CFCA
Igor.
event last week.
Beg your pardon. So that means, 2 out of 100 transactions that I make on this mobile could be subject to fraud. And I think that's a real challenge for our industry. And when you think about the myriad of combinations there are transacting through that device, how as an ecosystem do we tackle that? And the fact that there are so many companies in the audience today who work in that fraud space and offer different fraud solutions is testament to how complicated that ecosystem has become in terms of tackling different vulnerabilities that may impact consumer trust.
Now, Luigi, how does trust differentiate itself and break down? Because when you're talking about most messaging companies sending messages out to the average person on the street, you are dealing with sending messages to the team members of organizations.
Yes.
How is that different?
Yes, this relates to trust very inherently, in the sense that there is an element of trust in connection with the communications that you have with your coworkers, with your colleagues. Using this kind of tools has some specific nuances connected to, of course, making their phone ring, very simply. But the amount of times that you reach out to them, the kind of communication that you send, the fact that it is very much informal. Unlike email, you don't have to introduce your messages with lines and lines. So there is a layer that refers to your coworkers. I would say it also touches the clients indirectly, in the sense that you can exchange with your colleagues information referred to customers' data, so to clients' data. And so employees have to be aware that once they put the client's data on an instant messaging solution, it must be compliant, it must protect that piece of data. And of course, there is a level of trust also in relation to the companies that employ those people, because there is the reputation of that company at stake when something happens, when there is a fraud, when something happens on a trust and security level. There was this survey that was published last year about, it was by Veritas Technologies. They interviewed over 12,000 employees around the world. And they revealed that basically 75% of them was using WhatsApp or other non-compliant instant messaging tools to exchange sensitive data, critical data of the company. And around 30% of them had already been reprimanded by their managers for doing that. So we know, of course, here we don't want to criminalize the use of messaging. That's actually our business. What we Messagenius believe is that there must be a compliant instant messaging tool used internally in companies. Otherwise, dangers are enormous. Of course, with the pandemics and with typically the bring your own device policies, the lines have been blurred a little bit with all the problems that emerged from this kind of use of any app, and also consumer app to exchange professional information. But here it's not only about UX. Instant messaging is very efficient, very effective, but it's not only about that efficient and easy UX. It's also very much about data ownership. Who owns the conversation? Who owns the data? Because then these kind of questions open up another landscape connected to protecting those data, connected to defending the IP of the company, defending the core business and the assets of the company. We were talking with a bank, an Italian bank, that had left completely all the Meta products. Officially, they were telling us they didn't like the way they had managed the Cambridge Analytica issue. Off the records, they were telling us, we are using those tools, we are not owning our data, So basically, we are telling our clients, ask us for a loan via Facebook or via WhatsApp, because we are the bank that is close to the client. And oops, after 10 years of this game, we're discovering that Meta is becoming also a financial player in Europe, getting authorized for that. So it's also a matter of storing information and communications where they are safe, where the core business of the company is protected enough.
That actually leads me perfectly into my next question area, that who is responsible ultimately for delivering this trust? Because there's a weird thing at play that's to do with personal information. So on the one hand, we all want to remain protected, have our personal information protected. But on the other hand, most of us actually do know that if there are certain organizations out there that know where we are, they know, for example, that I haven't swapped the SIM card out in my phone, they know a whole series of a range of information about us, that actually that will protect me. So it comes down to education. But who is responsible for the trust? Is it unfair that it seems that particularly when it comes to the world of direct carrier billing, where you're involved in, so that's the ability to pay for goods and services by charging them to your phone bill, that in that area, where you are right now, Louise, the onus is 100% on the operator. Because the weird situation in that industry is if someone buys something, charges it to their mobile phone bill and has an issue, the first person they call is the mobile operator. They don't pick up the phone and call the provider of the service or the good. They call the operator. It's like me buying that chair at IKEA, for example, and then I've got a problem with it, but I'm going to call Visa. So why is it that mobile operators always seem to be the ones to have to carry this trust?
Yeah, I think that's long been an anomaly and a challenge with carrier billing mechanisms, whereby if you order a pizza on your Visa card and your pizza arrives cold, you don't call Visa and say, hey, I'm complaining about my cold pizza. You call Pizza Hut. But that's traditionally not been the case with carrier billing solutions. And I think that's because it's the difference between who owns the consumer. You know, carriers have a relationship with the consumer. They're delivering a whole bunch of core telephony services to that consumer under their brand. Whereas, Visa is essentially a payment gateway. So, it's actually Pizza Hut that owns the customer. They're just using that payment gateway as a method. And it might be Visa, it might be MasterCard, might be something else. So I think that's why we have that challenge in carrier billing. And it's not something that I know how to get over. But going back to the whole complexity of the ecosystem, where you have multiple types of transactions happening through multiple layers, via the carrier, via PayPal or whatever it is, I think that's why it's so hard to pinpoint who's responsible for making sure that a consumer can trust that transaction.
Luigi, digital identity. Does digital identity have what role does it have in actually increasing trust, or could it actually lead to a decrease in trust because consumers feel, these organizations actually know too much about me, how come?
I think it very much depends on what has to be done with that identity. So if it is functional to a certain process and the connection between that process and the request for the identity is made clear, crystal clear, there are higher chances that there is that level of trust. In our case, since we deal especially with internal comms, it's very much dependent to the internal procedures of the client company. For example, we have very strict procedures to verify identity for certain companies that have a distributed workforce. So for instance, they have technicians on the field and control rooms coordinating them. In one case, we work with a international electricity grid operator. In their case, they use our messaging to allow technicians to communicate with control rooms, and the verification of the identity is of paramount importance, because if someone enters into that communication and somehow changes the flow of messagings, of messaging, since those technicians put physically their hands on high voltage cables, they really are exposed to lethal risks. So together with the client companies, we implement a number of technical procedures by which taking in charge a ticket, having a new user coming on board on that specific ticket is very much regulated. And plus, to guarantee that level of security and trust, we try to force the interaction as much as possible, conveying it towards the manual, what the manuals of the company prescribe for the precise operation. So to be concrete, if they have certain operation involving this kind of comms between control room and technicians, we know what is the script of their communication. It's very codified, very regulated. So what we do is we implement interdependencies between messages. We inhibit certain communications until the preliminary steps are taken. And we don't allow users to type. We pre-suggest the messages. We put call to action buttons. We put take in charge buttons. And we authenticate not only the users signing in, but also the users sending certain specific communications that are referred to a very sensitive part of the workflow. So once I have to give green light in terms of the cable being out of tension, I don't just push on a call to action button, but I'm also required to authenticate that action with the biometrics of the phone, with a CAPTCHA code, or with an unlocking code of the device, and we implement an nth number of measures based on what the company requests to make sure that the identity of the users is guaranteed. And plus we install on-prem or on private cloud so that the communications have the same level of protection on the company's servers that all the other softwares have. But certainly this kind of comms for this kind of industries have been directly supervised by the CEO and the chief information officer of the company, because not only we contribute to the KPIs in terms of making the margin of errors drop, the digitization of process increase and so on, but also because there is lethal risk connected to exchanging comms in such a sensitive environment.
Can I ask you, just on the sales process of a solution like yours, when people are so used to having a solution, they just pay a small fixed amount per month for, or actually something free such as email, how hard is it actually to get this across that stop using what you're doing, you need to use something else which has a higher cost? Because it's for internal use,
yep.
So therefore there's no immediate return in value or increase in sales or conversion rates or anything like that.
Sure.
How hard is it?
It is hard in the sense that we only deal with large companies that have more than 500, 1,000 employees. But the first thing that make us take a step into the company is usually regulations. There is a number of internal policies or regulation or jurisdictions that force those companies to guarantee that that information is managed in a certain way and stored in a certain way. So regulations ranging from GDPR, the Cloud Act in the US basically allowing the US intelligence to access data of users that are not US citizens, even on servers that are not US based. The prescription of those regulations in terms of owning the data and protecting communications in sectors that are, for example, strategic for the national interest of a country is something that helps us to take the first step into the company. And then the second, I would say the second leverage that we use is often the increase of productivity by doing not just HChat, not just messaging with freedom to type whatever you want, but it's also the one of the workflow. So trying to guide the conversations for codified workflows towards what the manuals of the company prescribe. So you have on one side, let's say, the risks connected to compliance, to data ownership. On the other side, the other leverage that we see is the opportunity of making communications work better, serve specifically the workflow and the productivity needs of the customer company.
Okay.
This kind of reminds me of, back in the day in the UK financial services industry when a lot of companies realised that their agents were giving out financial advice via their mobile phones, not via the call centre, and that was a gap where they weren't covered by financial services regulations.
Yes, indeed, financial sector has been a landscape of huge scandals for the use of instant messaging, particularly in the US, I would say. In 2020, a top bank, if I'm not wrong, it should be Morgan Stanley. They fired 2 top managers because they were using WhatsApp for internal comms. A few months ago, I think in January this year, JP Morgan Chase accepted a fine of over $200 million by the SEC because they were tolerating that the employees internally were using consumer tools that were not under the surveillance of the national watchdog, national authority for communication in financial services. So, the scale of fines, 200 million, is so huge that companies easily understand that there are financial risks connected, reputation risks connected. You can't really joke. You can't really take it easy. I mean, this is the game of trust, but taking it as a game is not what I would prescribe, let's say.
Okay, we've heard in industries, particularly like financial services, which tend to be more heavily regulated perhaps than others, it's very clear there's that big financial penalty potentially hanging over organisations. Louise, though, we've kind of left it up to the imagination, really, of the audience, both here and online. So what happens if businesses and organisations, and dare I say it, governments as well, get trust wrong? What can the impacts be, other than just financial?
Oh, I think it can put the adoption of certain technologies, billing mechanisms, back a long way, and that's bad for the industry. I think consumer adoption is based on 2 things. It's based on ease of use, and it's based on trust and knowing that their data's safe. And as I alluded to at the beginning, I think most consumers, for convenience purposes, assume that everything is safe and that they can trust a certain mechanism until it goes wrong. And there have been many instances of that, data breaches, increase in smishing, particularly during the pandemic. When it goes wrong, consumers stop using that particular technology.
Luigi, you
yeah,
want to say
I would say beyond the financial consequences related to consumers, this applies to public sector in terms of votes. We can't count the number of scandals that many candidates have been through because they've been using not necessarily messaging, but possibly emails, personal emails for communications related to their position. We remember Hillary Clinton against Donald Trump. The very last weeks, there was a scandal about her using private email. This happens as a cycle in different jurisdictions, different countries, because it's something so common. During the pandemic, we remember Boris Johnson had posted a picture of himself doing a cabinet meeting on Zoom, while the Secret Services of the UK, literally a few weeks before, had said that the civil servants shouldn't use Zoom. Ironically, some weeks later, the former advisor for security of President Trump, General McMaster, was appointed to Zoom's board. So we know that there are movements related to the internal comms, both at the enterprise level and at a governmental level. And again, in the public sector, there were other cases in the defense and public sector industry. There was a case in Romania of a policeman that got sent to chase a criminal in the bush and got killed by this criminal while chasing him in the bush. But the order had been sent via WhatsApp. So there was a huge debate around how legitimate it is that someone, a civil servant, a policeman, goes somewhere risking their life for an order that is broadcast via WhatsApp. And then we go back still to defense and public safety, to the strategic interest referred to having that information stored on WhatsApp servers. There is basically a US company, so Cloud Act allows the US intelligence to access those comms, basically not even with a mandate of a magistrate. So even in the public sector, there are
It's interesting because you don't think of using your phone as being a life or death situation, but in that particular example, it is. And the audit trail of being able to audit that particular order that actually sent a policeman to his death is, that's how do you audit that?
How do we go about actually, as an industry, business messaging, securing this trust, and more importantly, if someone or something steps out of line, what should we do? Again, there's a balance between probably being too tough or probably too easy. What do we do, Louise?
I think it's really tough because there are so many moving parts and so many players in the ecosystem. And, you know, on the one hand, you don't want to stifle innovation by being too rigid, but on the other hand, you need to make sure that there is a level of trust amongst consumers to adopt various channels, etc. I think going back to Igor's point, I got that right this time, about there being 2.2% of fraud in the industry. I mean, is there an acceptable level of risk? Do we need to understand what that acceptable level of risk is? And there's risk across the industry, credit card risk, you know, all sorts of financial services risk. So do we have an acceptable amount of risk that we're prepared to accept in the ecosystem? I think the second point is that it takes collaboration. Between all of the different players. I don't think any one company can take that on board. There's a lot of companies in here providing different anti-fraud solutions and selling them into different parts of the ecosystem to address that. And the more coordination we can get, particularly through entities such as MEF coordinating those efforts, the better.
Excellent, because we do just happen to have a business SMS code of conduct. Yeah, okay. A little plug in there. I'm going to put more shameless plugs of that coming up over the next day and a bit. Luigi, so regarding regulation, shall we say, of business messaging, how heavy do you think is too heavy? There are instances of regulators around the world implementing things. They suddenly get the notion, they suddenly understand there's an issue, we need to do something. They become very heavy-handed. They have this knee-jerk reaction, and they end up stifling, constraining the market, and ultimately hurting the business messaging market. What level is right, and how do we go about, as well, working with regulators?
Our point of view in Messagenius on this is about no compromise on user experience and compliance. There is a way, in the sense that if companies offer to their employees a still very user-friendly but compliant alternative tool, there is no reason for not using those tools. So basically finding the right balance between offering people what they want, offering employees what they want, and respect the requirements of regulations. It would be pointless for us to start prohibiting the use of instant messaging. As a matter of fact, it has been spread so much, even the consumer tools, in the working environments, precisely, as a matter of fact, because messaging is useful at work. Companies have to guarantee that level of ease of use, but respecting all the regulations. In our case, what we do to ensure that this happens is that we install on-prem or on private cloud so that all the communications stay within the perimeter of the company that is generating those conversations and that data. We customize the encryption. That's another very important point. We customize the encryption and we give the encryption keys to different key people into the company so that no one is autonomously able to access a database of conversations and inspect conversations without having other people logged in on the database at the same time. We have a black box feature by which all the communications are stored on the servers. So even if someone deletes them from the client, they're always stored there on the servers. And we have double authentication for specific passages. To complete this, we give the solution in white label, so it's perceived as a tool that is part of the digital suite of the company, so under the company's brand, and this helps to make employees trust this tool because it's under the company's brand. And then it's very much up to the company to be able to give this kind of gentle push and roll out a policy to tell the employees, officially, we are now officially using this instant messaging tools that allows you to communicate as simply as you would use with WhatsApp, but fulfilling all the compliance requirements that we are subject to.
But isn't it difficult because we've just gone through a couple of years of something, and as a result of that, you had so many reactions by authorities, which meant instant changes to how businesses operated. So suddenly, people weren't allowed to go into the business from one night to the next morning within a few hours. They didn't have a week or 2 weeks to prepare, so people started using these chat apps, for example. It's tough, though, isn't it, to go back once you've been saying to people, as an emergency situation, let's all quickly jump on create this WhatsApp group, for example, and then to unroll and go back from that, going, no, but now we need to use this.
Sure. I think the pandemics, as a matter of necessity, imposed the need for a grace period, in the sense that every company had to make the work remote, so it's 100% legitimate to not paralyze the operations of the company to use what's on the shelf. That makes sense. Now, after more than 2 years, it makes sense that companies understand that there are viable alternatives that guarantee that same level of UX, which is, by the way, highest obstacle for employees. If their UX is smooth, is easy to digest for the users, they have no reason to resort to another tool that is consumer tool that exposes themselves to dangers, because at that point, it would be the employee having the responsibility of putting the company information on the servers of an American company, so it's the employee's choice. So there are different ways to make the employees understand and digest that it is not the case to use consumer tools. The key thing is to make the user experience as easy as possible to use. Once you have no friction to adopt those tools, then the door is open to basically provide them with the compliant tools that you have. Again, not easy to do, easier to say, but that's what we're here for.
And I think just going back to your point about regulators is, I think it's important for participants in the industry and the ecosystem to engage with regulators and, to be consultative and informative, and, statistics help, the role of the analysts in educating regulators as to what the size of the problem is a good thing.
Okay. Now, we're coming up to the close of our session, so I'd just like to go and ask if any of you here in the room have any questions, if there are any online questions. If not, I have, okay, no problem. Anyone here in the room? No problem. I have another one of my own anyway. So what are the key threats to customer trust out there? I think it's safe to say consumers are rattled. They've had a really rough couple of years. And hopefully there's a lot of light and we're emerging from this 2-year plus tunnel period. But what potential threats are there around to really give consumer trust a kick and knock it back down again?
I think the growing complexity and the proliferation of channels is the biggest threat, and how as an industry do we marshal all of the vulnerabilities and address them across the ecosystem.
Luigi?
In our case, we believe that embedding the communication layer into digital environments of the same company, of the same brand, is key to make the user associate that communication, the level of trust that the user has towards the brand. So we would absorb the messaging. Our position is companies should absorb the messaging layer into their brand to be able to communicate with users in such a way that those communications are trusted. And we do it technically via integration into apps that the brand already has to interact with users.
Okay. And again, we'll be talking about this tomorrow, looking at SMEs in particular, because Luigi, in your business you mentioned you focus on larger companies, typically 500 employees or more, and I'm sure it's a different ballgame when we come to the SME. So I'd like to thank Luigi Fidelio, who is the co-founder and chief revenue officer of internal messaging experts Messagenius. Thank you very much for coming along.
Thank you.
And Louise Ford, who is the managing director of Empello. Lovely having you both with me on this panel. Thank you.